There is a question that analysts in Washington, military planners, and global markets are all quietly asking right now. What if the current situation in the Middle East is not a short-term crisis, but the beginning of something far more complex? Because if you look beyond the headlines, beyond the daily updates and official statements, a different picture starts to emerge. One where the risks are not just regional, but global, and more importantly, unpredictable. Now, before we go any further, let's be clear about something. This is a fast-moving situation. Details change, narratives shift, and much of what we're seeing is still being interpreted in real time. But based on publicly available reports, expert analysis, and historical patterns, there are several developments that deserve closer attention, because they may shape what happens next. Over the past few weeks, tensions across the Middle East have increased significantly. Military activity has expanded, regional actors are becoming more involved, and diplomatic efforts, while ongoing, appear increasingly strained. According to multiple international reports, the situation is no longer confined to a single flashpoint. Instead, it is beginning to resemble a wider network of interconnected conflicts. And that matters, because historically, conflicts in this region don't stay contained for long. They evolve, they pull in allies, they impact trade routes, and sometimes they escalate in ways that were never part of the original plan. Now, officials in Washington have emphasized that their objective is stability. At the same time, analysts note that achieving stability in such a complex environment is rarely straightforward, especially when multiple countries, interests, and strategies are involved simultaneously. So, what makes this moment different from previous crises? One key factor is the level of interconnected risk. In earlier conflicts, escalation often followed a more predictable pattern. But today, the situation is shaped by a mix of advanced military technology, economic interdependence, and real-time global communication, which means events unfold faster and reactions come quicker. There is also the issue of perception. Different countries involved in the situation are not necessarily operating with the same definition of success. For some, success may mean deterrence. For others, it may mean survival. And for others, it may be about long-term strategic positioning. When those definitions don't align, it becomes much harder to reach a stable outcome, because each side may believe it is acting rationally, even as the overall situation becomes more unstable. One of the most immediate impacts of rising tensions is economic, and this is where things begin to affect not just governments, but everyday people. Energy markets, in particular, are highly sensitive to developments in the Middle East. Even the possibility of disruption can lead to price volatility. According to recent market analyses, oil prices have already shown signs of reacting to uncertainty in the region. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a long-term spike is guaranteed, but it does highlight how closely global markets are tied to geopolitical stability. And for the United States, this connection is especially important, because energy prices influence transportation costs, inflation, and consumer spending, all of which have direct political and economic implications. So, while the situation may seem distant geographically, its effects can be felt much closer to home. From a strategic perspective, the United States is facing a complex balancing act. On one hand, there is a need to support allies and maintain regional stability. On the other hand, there is a growing awareness of the risks associated with prolonged involvement. Military analysts often point out that modern conflicts are not just about firepower. They are about sustainability. How long can operations be maintained? What are the long-term costs? And how does public opinion evolve over time? These questions don't always have clear answers, but they are critical, because history shows that even the most powerful nations must consider not just how a conflict begins, but how it might end. Another important dimension is domestic politics. In the United States, foreign policy decisions are often influenced by internal considerations. Public opinion, economic conditions, and upcoming elections can all shape how a situation is approached. That doesn't mean decisions are purely political, but it does mean that timing and perception matter. A prolonged crisis, especially one with visible economic impact, can become a significant issue for policymakers. And that adds another layer of complexity, because now, decisions are being made not just in response to external developments, but also internal pressures. One of the biggest concerns raised by analysts right now is the risk of unintended escalation. In highly tense environments, conflicts don't always expand because of deliberate decisions. Sometimes they grow because of small, seemingly contained incidents that spiral beyond control. A miscalculation, a misinterpretation, or even a delayed response. These are not just theoretical risks, they are patterns that have appeared repeatedly throughout modern history. When multiple actors are operating in the same region, often with different objectives, different intelligence assessments, and different thresholds for response, the margin for error becomes extremely thin. For example, a defensive action by one side may be perceived as an offensive move by another. A warning signal may be misunderstood as a direct threat, and a limited strike could be interpreted as the beginning of a much larger campaign. In that kind of environment, decisions have to be made quickly, sometimes within minutes. And when decisions are made under pressure, without complete information, the chances of misjudgment increase significantly. This is why communication channels, even between adversaries, are considered so critical. These channels are not about cooperation or agreement. They exist to prevent accidents. Military hotlines, back-channel diplomacy, and indirect messaging systems all serve one primary purpose: to reduce uncertainty. Because when both sides have at least some level of clarity about each other's intentions, the risk of escalation can be managed. However, as tensions rise, maintaining these communication pathways becomes more difficult. Trust begins to erode, messages are questioned, signals are second-guessed, and in some cases, communication may slow down or break entirely. That's when uncertainty increases, and uncertainty is where escalation thrives. Another factor to consider is the speed of modern warfare. With advanced surveillance systems, rapid response capabilities, and real-time intelligence, events unfold much faster than they did in the past. That speed can be an advantage, but it also creates pressure. Leaders and commanders may feel compelled to act quickly, sometimes before a situation is fully understood. And once actions are taken, they can trigger reactions that are equally fast, creating a chain of escalation that becomes difficult to interrupt. It's also important to recognize that not all escalation is intentional. In many cases, neither side is actively seeking a larger conflict. But when communication breaks down and when actions are interpreted in the worst possible light, escalation can happen anyway, almost by momentum. That is what makes the current situation particularly sensitive. It's not just about what each side plans to do. It's about how those actions are perceived and how quickly others respond. Because in an environment like this, the difference between containment and escalation can come down to a single moment, a single decision, or a single misunderstanding. It's also important to understand that this situation is not just a regional issue confined to one part of the world. What happens in the Middle East rarely stays in the Middle East. Instead, it sends ripple effects across the global system, economically, politically, and strategically. That's why major global powers are watching very closely, not necessarily as direct participants on the battlefield, but as stakeholders in the outcome, because the consequences of this situation extend far beyond any single country. One of the most immediate areas of impact is global energy. The Middle East remains one of the most critical regions for oil and gas production. Any disruption, or even the possibility of disruption, can influence global energy flows. Shipping routes, supply chains, and pricing structures all become sensitive to instability. And when energy markets react, the effects are felt worldwide. From fuel prices to inflation, from manufacturing costs to consumer spending. Entire economies can feel the pressure. But energy is only one part of the equation. There is also the question of international alliances. Situations like this often test relationships between countries. Allies may find themselves under pressure to take positions, offer support, or navigate difficult diplomatic choices. At the same time, countries that are not directly involved may still adjust their strategies based on how events unfold. Because every major conflict reshapes perceptions. Who is reliable? Who is influential? And who is willing to act? These perceptions can have long-term consequences for global alignment and cooperation. Another critical dimension is strategic calculation. Military planners and policymakers around the world study conflicts like this very carefully, not just for what is happening, but for what can be learned from it. How effective are certain technologies? How do different strategies perform under pressure? What works and what doesn't? These are questions that go far beyond the current situation, because the answers help shape future decisions. In many ways, modern conflicts also function as real-time case studies, where tactics are observed, systems are tested, and responses are analyzed in detail. This doesn't mean that countries are looking to replicate conflict, but they are paying attention. Because understanding how others operate, especially in high-stakes environments, is a key part of long-term planning. At the same time, it's important not to jump to conclusions. The presence of global interest does not automatically mean a wider conflict is inevitable. In fact, in many cases, international attention can encourage restraint. Diplomatic pressure, economic considerations, and mutual risk all play a role in preventing escalation. However, what this situation clearly demonstrates is how interconnected the modern world has become. A regional crisis can influence global markets. A local decision can affect international stability. And a single development can trigger reactions across multiple continents. That level of interconnectedness increases both the stakes and the complexity. Because now, managing a conflict is not just about local dynamics. It's about understanding how those dynamics interact with a much larger global system. And in a system like that, even small shifts can have far-reaching consequences. So where does this go from here? At this stage, there isn't a single clear answer, and that uncertainty is exactly what makes the situation so important to watch. Instead of one predictable path, there are several possible scenarios. Each one depends on how key decisions are made in the coming days and weeks, and how different actors respond to events as they unfold. The first scenario is de-escalation. In this outcome, diplomatic efforts begin to gain traction. Communication channels remain open, even if quietly. Tensions, while still present, start to ease over time. This doesn't necessarily mean a perfect resolution or a long-term agreement. In many cases, de-escalation simply means that all sides reach a point where continuing the conflict no longer serves their immediate interests. So instead of pushing further, they step back. Sometimes this involves negotiated understandings. Sometimes it involves informal arrangements. And sometimes it simply reflects a mutual recognition of the risks involved. History has shown that even highly tense situations can move toward stabilization, especially when the costs of escalation become too high for all parties involved. However, de-escalation requires timing, communication, and a degree of willingness from each side. And that's not always guaranteed. The second scenario is prolonged uncertainty. This is often the most overlooked outcome, but in many ways, it is the most common. In this case, the situation does not fully resolve, but it also does not spiral into a major escalation. Instead, it continues at a lower intensity. There may be periodic incidents, limited actions, or ongoing tensions that never fully disappear. From the outside, it can look like a holding pattern, but underneath, pressure continues to build. This kind of environment can last for months, sometimes even years, and while it may seem more stable than open conflict, it still carries risks. Because prolonged uncertainty can lead to fatigue, miscalculations, or sudden shifts that change the trajectory unexpectedly. It also keeps markets, governments, and populations in a constant state of alert, never fully settled, always watching for the next development. Then there is the more concerning possibility: escalation. This doesn't necessarily mean a full-scale, all-out conflict. Escalation can take many forms. It could involve the expansion of the situation into new geographic areas. It could involve additional actors becoming more directly involved. Or it could extend into new domains, such as cyber operations or economic measures. What makes escalation particularly challenging is that it often happens step by step, not through a single dramatic moment, but through a series of smaller developments that gradually increase the intensity of the situation. Each step may seem limited on its own, but together they can create a dynamic that becomes difficult to reverse. It's also worth noting that escalation is not always intentional. In some cases, it emerges from a chain reaction of responses, where one action leads to another, and then another, until the situation reaches a point where de-escalation becomes much harder to achieve. Ultimately, each of these outcomes depends on a range of factors: diplomatic efforts, strategic decisions, economic pressures, and the broader international response. Many of these factors are still evolving, which means the situation remains fluid. And in a fluid environment, even small changes can shift the direction significantly. That's why, for now, the most accurate answer is not certainty, but possibility. And understanding those possibilities is key to understanding what may come next. For those trying to understand where things are headed, the challenge is not a lack of information, it's knowing which signals actually matter. In complex geopolitical situations like this, there is always a constant flow of headlines, statements, and breaking updates. But not all of them carry equal weight. That's why analysts tend to focus on a few key indicators, patterns that, over time, can provide insight into the direction the situation may be taking. The first is changes in military posture. This doesn't just mean visible action on the ground. It includes troop movements, positioning of assets, defensive deployments, and shifts in readiness levels. Sometimes, what countries prepare for tells you more than what they publicly announce. For example, an increase in defensive systems may suggest concern about incoming threats. A repositioning of forces may indicate anticipation of escalation. And a slowdown in activity could signal an attempt to stabilize the situation. These movements are often subtle, but they are closely watched because they reflect real intentions, not just public messaging. The second indicator is shifts in diplomatic messaging. What leaders say, and how they say it, can offer important clues. Are statements becoming more aggressive or more measured? Is the language focused on deterrence, or is it opening the door to dialogue? Even small changes in tone can signal larger strategic shifts. It's also important to pay attention to what is not being said. Silence, delays in response, or carefully worded statements can sometimes indicate that behind-the-scenes discussions are taking place. Diplomacy doesn't always happen in public view, but its effects often show up in the language used by officials. The third key area is movements in energy markets. Global energy prices are highly sensitive to instability, especially in regions that play a major role in production and transportation. Sharp increases in prices may reflect rising concern about supply disruptions. Stability in the markets may suggest confidence that the situation will remain contained. While markets are not perfect predictors, they do react quickly to perceived risk. And in doing so, they provide a real-time reflection of global sentiment. The fourth indicator is the response from major global powers. Even countries that are not directly involved in the situation often play an important role. Their statements, actions, and diplomatic engagement can influence how events unfold. Are they calling for restraint? Are they increasing their presence in the region? Or are they taking a more cautious, observational approach? These responses can shape the broader environment, either contributing to stability or adding to the pressure. What makes all of these indicators important is that they work together. No single signal provides a complete picture. But when multiple indicators begin to align, they can offer a clearer sense of direction. Even then, it's important to recognize that these signals don't provide certainty. Geopolitical situations are influenced by human decisions, and those decisions can change quickly. Unexpected developments can shift the trajectory in ways that are difficult to predict. However, insight is still possible. And in situations like this, even small insights can be valuable because they help move beyond reaction and toward understanding. And in a rapidly evolving environment, understanding is one of the most important tools anyone can have. At the end of the day, the most important thing to understand is this: not every crisis follows a predictable path, and not every strategy produces the intended outcome. What we're seeing right now is a situation that is still unfolding, still being shaped, and still uncertain, which means the story isn't over. In many ways, it's just beginning. And the decisions made in the coming weeks may have consequences that extend far beyond the region itself.